Some weights never make sense. No matter how many times you check the math. I'm Vincent, and I've been operating cremation equipment at Riverside Memorial for 12 years. In this line of work, you learn to appreciate routine, the predictable hum of machinery, the careful documentation, the quiet respect that comes with handling someone's final journey. Every morning, I arrive at 6:30, check the equipment logs, review the day's schedule, and prepare the chambers. The work requires precision. Families trust us with what remains of their loved ones, and that trust is sacred. Mrs. Eleanor Carmichael arrived on a Tuesday morning in February. According to her file, she was 83 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and weighed 98 pounds at the time of death. A small woman who'd spent her final months in hospice care, diminished by illness but surrounded by family who spoke of her gentle spirit and her love of gardening. Her daughter had requested a simple cremation with no viewing, wanting to remember her mother as she'd been in life, rather than as illness had left her. I loaded Mrs. Carmichael into Chamber 2, the same chamber I'd used hundreds of times before. The process should have taken 3 hours, maybe 3.5 at most for someone her size. I set the timer, initiated the cycle, and settled into my usual routine of paperwork and equipment maintenance. But as the morning stretched into afternoon, something felt wrong. The chamber was running hot, hotter than usual, but the cycle wasn't completing. I checked the temperature readings twice, then 3 times. Everything appeared normal, yet the system refused to finish its sequence. At the 4-hour mark, I opened the viewing port to assess progress. What I saw made me step back from the chamber entirely. Through the reinforced glass, Mrs. Carmichael's form seemed different somehow. Not larger, exactly, but denser, more substantial. And then I noticed something that made my hands shake as I gripped the control panel. Her chest appeared to be moving, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but with the steady rhythm of breathing. I closed my eyes, counted to 10, and looked again. The movement continued, slow, peaceful breaths that should have been impossible. I'd seen optical illusions caused by heat distortion before, tricks of light and temperature that could make still objects appear to move. But this was different. This felt deliberate. I called my supervisor, Marcus, who'd been in the business for 25 years. When he arrived, the movement had stopped, but the cycle still hadn't completed. We stood together, watching through the viewing port, neither of us speaking about what we might or might not have seen. Marcus checked the computer logs, verified the chamber settings, and suggested we simply wait. 2 hours later, the cycle finally finished. As I prepared to collect the remains, I noticed the collection chamber seemed fuller than expected. I weighed the ashes 3 times, using 2 different scales to be certain. Mrs. Eleanor Carmichael, who had weighed 98 pounds in life, had left behind 11 pounds of cremated remains. For someone her size, we should have collected 4, maybe 5 pounds of ashes. 11 pounds was what you'd expect from a person weighing close to 200 pounds. I checked the files again, examined the nameplate, verified every detail. There was no mistake. Somehow, Mrs. Carmichael had left behind twice the remains she should have. Marcus and I never spoke about the breathing. We documented the weight discrepancy as an administrative error, noted possible equipment malfunction for review, and completed the paperwork. But I started paying closer attention during cremations after that day, not looking for anything specific, just watching more carefully. 3 weeks later, during Mr. Patterson's cremation, I thought I saw movement again. Just for a moment, through the viewing port. Mr. Patterson had been a large man in life, 240 pounds, but his ashes weighed exactly what Mrs. Carmichael should have, 4.5 pounds. I've never found an explanation for what happened that February morning. The equipment was serviced and found to be in perfect working order. The scales were calibrated and accurate. Mrs. Carmichael's family received their ashes, never knowing about the discrepancy. But sometimes, during quiet moments between cremations, I find myself wondering about weight, not just physical weight, but the weight of a life, of memories, of love left behind. Maybe some people carry more than their bodies suggest. Maybe Mrs. Carmichael, small as she was, had accumulated something heavier than bone and tissue during her 83 years. Something that couldn't be measured on any scale we have, but somehow registered in those final moments when everything else burned away. The dead are supposed to stay cold. I'm Sarah, and I work the overnight shift at Peaceful Rest Crematory, monitoring our facility from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. It's quiet work, mostly routine checking temperature sensors, reviewing security footage, preparing bodies for morning cremations. The isolation suits me. I've always preferred the calm of nighttime hours, when the world feels more honest somehow, stripped of daytime pretenses. Our facility maintains strict temperature controls throughout. The preparation rooms stay between 35 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The storage areas even colder. Bodies await their final services in climate-controlled dignity, and our monitoring system alerts me to any fluctuations that might compromise preservation. In 3 years of overnight shifts, I'd never seen a temperature anomaly that wasn't easily explained. A door left ajar, a sensor malfunction, a brief power fluctuation. Mrs. Dorothy Holloway arrived on a Thursday evening, transported from the hospital where she'd passed peacefully after a long illness. The paperwork indicated she'd been deceased for 3 days, held in hospital refrigeration until her family could make arrangements. She was scheduled for cremation the following afternoon, which gave me the night to complete preparation and documentation. I wheeled Mrs. Holloway into Prep Room 3 at midnight, noting the ambient temperature reading of 38 degrees on my log sheet. She was a dignified woman, even in death, gray hair neatly styled, hands folded peacefully over her chest. Her daughter had brought her mother's favorite dress, a soft blue fabric with tiny pearl buttons, along with a request that we take special care with her appearance for the family's private viewing before cremation. The preparation process is methodical and respectful. I positioned Mrs. Holloway on the table, adjusted the lighting, and began gathering the cosmetics and supplies I'd need. The room's temperature monitor displayed steadily on my peripheral vision 38 degrees, exactly where it should be. But as I worked, something felt different. Not wrong, exactly, but unusual. I first noticed it around 1 a.m. The room felt warmer, though the digital display still read 38 degrees. I attributed it to my own body heat, the physical effort of preparation work. But by 1:30, I was certain something had changed. The air felt thick, almost humid, like a summer evening rather than a refrigerated mortuary space. I checked the thermostat controls, examined the ventilation system, looked for any obvious malfunctions. Everything appeared normal. The digital readout continued to display 38 degrees, but the discrepancy between what the sensors reported and what I felt grew more pronounced with each passing minute. At 2 a.m., I stepped outside Prep Room 3 to compare temperatures. The hallway felt noticeably cooler, properly climate-controlled. But when I returned to the preparation room, warmth enveloped me, like stepping into a different building entirely. I documented the sensation in my log, noting possible HVAC irregularities for morning review. Then, at 2:15, the temperature sensor spiked. I watched the digital display climb from 38 degrees to 60, then 70, then higher. Within minutes, it reached 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, human body temperature, and held steady. The room felt tropical now, oppressively warm and humid. I could feel perspiration beading on my forehead as I stared at Mrs. Holloway's serene face. She looked exactly the same, peaceful, dignified, properly preserved, but the air around her seemed to shimmer with heat, like pavement on a summer day. I placed my hand near her arm, not touching but close enough to sense temperature. Warmth radiated from her body, gentle but unmistakable. I called our maintenance service, explaining the apparent malfunction. The technician who arrived 20 minutes later found nothing wrong with the climate control system. According to his instruments, Prep Room 3 maintained a steady 38 degrees. When he checked our digital sensor, it read 38 degrees, but I could feel the heat, see the slight shimmer in the air. The technician suggested I might be experiencing fatigue or stress. Overnight shifts can affect perception, he said. He recommended I take a break, get some fresh air. But when I returned after 15 minutes outside, the warmth remained. Mrs. Holloway lay exactly as I'd left her, but the air around her felt like standing near a radiator. At 3 a.m., the temperature reading returned to 38 degrees. The oppressive warmth faded gradually, leaving behind the familiar chill of proper refrigeration. I completed my preparation work in normal conditions, documenting everything in my log with clinical precision, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something significant had occurred. Something beyond equipment malfunction or perceptual error. Mrs. Holloway's cremation proceeded normally the next day. Her family spoke lovingly of her warmth, how she'd made everyone feel welcome, how her presence had filled rooms with comfort and joy. They described a woman who'd radiated kindness throughout her life, whose love had warmed countless hearts. I've never experienced another temperature anomaly like that night. The monitoring system has functioned perfectly, recording accurate readings without fluctuation. But sometimes, during quiet overnight hours, I find myself thinking about warmth, not just physical heat, but the warmth of human connection, of love that persists beyond life's boundaries. Maybe some people carry their warmth with them, even into death. Maybe Mrs. Holloway, who'd spent her life making others feel comfortable and loved, had held onto that quality for just a few hours longer than biology suggests possible. The dead are supposed to stay cold, but perhaps the most loving souls need a little more time to let their warmth fade away. Some requests seem reasonable until you fulfill them. I'm Director Chen, and I've managed Memorial Gardens Crematory for 8 years, always striving to balance operational efficiency with compassionate service. Families come to us during their darkest hours, seeking dignity and closure for their loved ones. Over the years, I've accommodated countless special requests, favorite music during services, specific timing to align with religious observances, custom urns that reflect personal interests. Most requests are simple acts of love that help families process their grief. In 2022, I received an unusual request from 3 separate families within a month. Each asked if they could witness their loved one's cremation directly, not just the ceremonial placement into the chamber, but the actual process itself. They wanted visual confirmation that their family member had been properly honored, that the cremation had been completed with the respect and care they deserve. Initially, I explained that our standard practice didn't include direct observation of the cremation process. The chambers operate at temperatures exceeding 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, creating conditions that aren't suitable for viewing. But the families persisted, explaining that their cultural traditions emphasized witnessing every step of their loved one's final journey. Their requests were heartfelt and sincere, spoken with the quiet dignity of people processing profound loss. After consulting with our legal team and reviewing industry practices, I decided to install a small viewing window in Chamber 2. The modification cost several $1,000s and required specialized heat-resistant glass that could withstand extreme temperatures while providing clear visibility. The window measured 6 inches by 8 inches, large enough for meaningful observation, small enough to maintain chamber integrity. The first family to use the viewing window was the Patterson family. Mr. Robert Patterson had been a retired teacher, beloved by his community and survived by 3 children and 7 grandchildren. His daughter Michelle had been particularly insistent about witnessing the cremation, explaining that her father had always emphasized the importance of seeing things through to completion. The service proceeded normally. Mr. Patterson's casket was positioned in the chamber with appropriate ceremony, and I activated the cremation sequence while Michelle and her family watched through the viewing window. For the first 30 minutes, everything appeared exactly as expected: the gradual increase in temperature, the natural progression of the cremation process, the steady reduction of organic matter. But at the 40-minute mark, Michelle suddenly pressed her face against the viewing window and called out, "Dad's sitting up!" I looked through the window myself, expecting to see the optical effects that extreme heat can create: distortions, shadows, the appearance of movement where none exists. Instead, I saw something that made me question my understanding of what was possible. Through the flames and heat distortion, a human form appeared to be moving deliberately, sitting upright in the center of the chamber. The figure seemed to lift one arm, moving it in what Michelle interpreted as a waving motion. The gesture lasted perhaps 10 seconds before the form settled back down, resuming the expected stillness of cremation. Michelle was crying now, but not from grief, from joy. She believed her father had acknowledged her presence, had given her the final goodbye she'd hoped for. I checked our security cameras immediately, reviewing the footage from multiple angles. The recording showed no unusual activity, just the normal progression of cremation, with no movement or anomalous shapes. The chamber's internal sensors reported standard temperatures and conditions throughout the process. Yet 3 family members had witnessed the same apparent movement through the viewing window. Word spread quickly through our community. Within weeks, I received dozens of requests for viewing window access, all from families seeking the same kind of closure Michelle had found. But I began to notice a pattern in subsequent viewings that troubled me deeply. Family members consistently reported seeing movement, gestures, or acknowledgments from their deceased loved ones, while our security systems recorded nothing unusual. Mrs. Chen's cremation was particularly disturbing. Her grandson claimed she had turned her head to look directly at him through the viewing window, maintaining eye contact for nearly a minute before looking away. He described the experience as comforting, saying his grandmother had always been protective, and he felt she was checking on him one final time. But when I reviewed the security footage later, I saw something the family hadn't mentioned. At the exact moment the grandson described eye contact, the camera captured a brief distortion in the image, not heat-related, but something that looked almost like interference, as if the recording equipment had momentarily malfunctioned. The distortion lasted exactly 58 seconds. The breaking point came during Mr. Harrison's cremation. His wife stood at the viewing window for the entire process, narrating what she saw to other family members. She described her husband sitting up, waving, even appearing to mouth words to her. The family was deeply moved by what they perceived as his final communication. But our security system recorded something different. The cameras showed the viewing window itself changing, not the chamber interior, but the glass itself. For brief periods, the window appeared to display images that weren't present in the chamber, as if it had become a screen showing different footage. The images were subtle, easily mistaken for heat distortion or reflection, but they didn't match what should have been visible through normal observation. I sealed the viewing window the next morning and discontinued the service. When families asked why, I explained that technical difficulties made the window unsuitable for continued use. Most accept this explanation, though some press for more details I can't provide. The window remains sealed, covered by a metal plate that bears no indication of what lies beneath. But sometimes, during quiet moments between services, I find myself standing near Chamber 2 and wondering about perception, about what we see versus what exists, about the difference between comfort and truth. Maybe the viewing window showed families exactly what they needed to see, regardless of objective reality. Maybe grief creates its own kind of vision, one that transcends physical limitations. Or maybe some things are better left unobserved, witnessed only by flames hot enough to transform everything they touch. The longest drives are the ones that never end. I'm Luis, and I've been transporting the deceased for Westfield Memorial Services for 6 years. It's solitary work that suits my temperament: long drives through quiet countryside, time to think, the responsibility of ensuring someone's final journey proceeds with dignity and care. Most transports are routine: pick up from hospital or home, drive to crematory or cemetery, deliver with appropriate ceremony. The work requires reliability above all else. And I take pride in never being late, never making mistakes that could compound a family's grief. Mrs. Esperanza Garcia was scheduled for transport on a Thursday morning in March. She'd passed peacefully at home, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, after a long life filled with love and service to her community. The family had chosen cremation at Riverside Memorial, about a 3-hour drive from their hometown, because Mrs. Garcia had specifically requested their services in her final instructions. I arrived at the Garcia home at 8 a.m. to find the family gathered for final farewells. They'd prepared Mrs. Garcia beautifully dressed in her favorite white dress, hands folded over a rosary she'd carried for 40 years, surrounded by photographs and flowers that spoke of a life well lived. Her grandson Miguel, maybe 8 years old, stood closest to the casket with the serious expression children wear when they're trying to understand something beyond their years. As I prepared for departure, Miguel approached me quietly. His grandmother had always told him she would never truly leave the family, he explained. She'd promised to watch over them always, to remain present in their lives, even after death. He spoke with the matter-of-fact certainty children possess about things adults have learned to question, and I assured him that his grandmother would indeed remain with them in memory and love. The loading process proceeded normally. Mrs. Garcia's casket was secured properly in the hearse, surrounded by floral arrangements her family had chosen with obvious care. I completed my pre-transport checklist, confirmed the route and arrival time with Riverside Memorial, and began what should have been a straightforward 3-hour journey. For the first hour, everything felt routine. I drove through familiar countryside, listening to quiet music and thinking about the families I'd served, the stories I'd heard, the privilege of being trusted with such important work. The hearse handled well, the weather was clear, and I expected to arrive at Riverside Memorial precisely on schedule. But as I approached the halfway point of the journey, something began to feel wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just subtly off, like a song played in the wrong key. The hearse started pulling slightly to the right, requiring constant correction to maintain straight travel. I checked my mirrors, scanned the road for hazards, but found nothing that could explain the vehicle's behavior. The pulling sensation grew stronger over the next 30 minutes. By the 2-hour mark, I was fighting the steering wheel constantly, the hearse insisting on drifting toward the shoulder despite my efforts. I pulled over at a rest area to inspect the vehicle, checking tire pressure, looking for obvious mechanical problems, examining the load securement. Everything appeared normal. The tires looked fine. The casket remained properly positioned. All systems functioned correctly. But when I resumed driving, the rightward pull continued, now strong enough that I had to grip the steering wheel with both hands to maintain control. It felt as if some external force was trying to guide the hearse off the main road. 20 minutes later, I felt the unmistakable sensation of a flat tire. I pulled over immediately and discovered the right rear tire was completely deflated, sitting flat against the rim. But when I examined the tire closely, I found no puncture, no obvious cause for the failure. The tire appeared intact, the valve stem was secure, yet it held no air whatsoever. I called for roadside assistance and waited beside the hearse, troubled by the inexplicable tire failure. While I waited, I checked the other tires and found them in perfect condition, proper pressure, no visible damage, normal wear patterns. Only the right rear tire had failed, and for no reason I could determine. The service technician who arrived an hour later was equally puzzled. He examined the tire thoroughly, testing for leaks, checking the rim, looking for any explanation for the sudden failure. Finding none, he installed my spare tire and suggested I have the flat tire inspected by a specialist. The spare held air normally, and the hearse handled properly for the remainder of the journey. I arrived at Riverside Memorial 3 hours behind schedule, deeply apologetic for the delay. But when I explained the circumstances to Director Morrison, his expression grew thoughtful rather than irritated. He'd experienced similar unexplained delays with certain transports over the years. He said mechanical failures that defied explanation. routes that seemed to take longer than they should, vehicles that behaved strangely only during specific journeys. Mrs. Garcia's cremation proceeded normally, and her family expressed no concern about the delayed arrival. In fact, Miguel's mother mentioned that the timing worked better for them. They'd needed extra time to complete some final arrangements, and the delay had been surprisingly helpful. I had the flat tire examined by 2 different specialists. Both found the tire in perfect condition, with no punctures, no structural damage, no reason it should have lost air. The tire held pressure normally when tested and showed no signs of failure. I eventually had it remounted and have used it without incident for hundreds of miles since. But I think about that transport often, especially Miguel's words about his grandmother never leaving the family. Maybe some people aren't ready for their final journey to proceed on schedule. Maybe love creates its own kind of resistance, a reluctance to move forward that manifests in unexpected ways, a pulling sensation, a delay that gives families more time, a flat tire that can't be explained, but serves a purpose beyond mechanical failure. The longest drives are the ones where someone isn't quite ready to reach their destination. And perhaps that's not always a problem to solve, but a message to understand. Numbers don't lie, but sometimes they don't tell the truth either. I'm Janet, and I've supervised operations at Eternal Rest Crematory for 11 years, maintaining the detailed records and precise inventory controls that families depend on during their most difficult time. Every morning, I arrive at 7 a.m. to conduct my inventory count, confirming that every urn, every set of remains, every memorial item is exactly where it should be. Accuracy isn't just professional responsibility, it's sacred trust. Our storage facility houses completed cremations awaiting family pickup, temporary holds for pending services, and memorial items families have entrusted to our care. I maintain detailed logs of every item, cross-referenced by date, name, and storage location. In 11 years of mourning counts, I'd never found a discrepancy that couldn't be explained by paperwork errors, mislabeled containers, or simple clerical mistakes. Tuesday morning in October began like any other. I unlocked the storage facility, activated the lighting, and began my methodical count of urns in Section A. Row by row, shelf by shelf, I verified each container against my master inventory list. Section A held 22 urns, all accounted for and properly labeled. I moved to Section B with the satisfaction that comes from maintained order, but Section B contained 23 urns instead of the expected 22. I recounted twice, then checked my inventory sheets carefully. According to my records, Section B should have held exactly 22 urns from recent cremations awaiting family arrangements. Yet a 23rd urn sat on the middle shelf, bearing a nameplate I recognized, but couldn't immediately place. The nameplate read, Margaret Rose Thompson, and the urn was identical to our standard bronze memorial containers. It looked entirely appropriate, properly labeled, seemingly belonging exactly where I'd found it. But Margaret Rose Thompson wasn't on any of my current inventory lists. Her name didn't appear in recent cremation records, pending services, or scheduled pickups. I searched my computer files thoroughly, checking records from the past month, then 2 months, then 6. Finally, I found Margaret Rose Thompson in our archives from 8 months earlier. She'd been cremated in February, and her ashes had been collected by her daughter 3 days after the service. According to my records, her case had been closed completely, with no remaining inventory or pending business. Yet here was an urn bearing her name, containing what appeared to be cremated remains, sitting in our active storage area, as if she'd just been processed. I weighed the contents approximately 5 pounds, consistent with cremated remains from someone of Mrs. Thompson's size. The urn showed no signs of tampering. The seal was intact, and the nameplate was professionally engraved with the same font and style we used consistently. I checked our delivery records, thinking perhaps the family had returned the ashes for some reason, but we had no record of any returns, no communication from Mrs. Thompson's family since they'd collected her remains months earlier. I called our administrative office to verify that no staff member had moved or relocated any urns. But everyone confirmed they hadn't touched Section B inventory. More troubling was what I discovered when I checked our original storage location for Mrs. Thompson's ashes. In February, I'd placed her urn in Section C, Slot 15, where it had remained until family pickup. But Slot 15 in Section C was occupied by a different urn, one that belonged there according to current inventory records. There was no empty space, no indication that anything had been removed or relocated. I spent the morning reviewing security footage from the past week, looking for any indication of how the extra urn had appeared in Section B. The cameras showed normal operations, routine staff movements, nothing that could explain the mysterious addition to our inventory. No one had entered Section B carrying an urn. No one had moved items between storage areas. By afternoon, I was questioning my own record-keeping abilities. I triple-checked my inventory systems, reviewed procedural logs, examined every aspect of our storage protocols. Everything was accurate and properly maintained. Yet we had an extra urn containing the remains of someone who'd already been claimed by family 8 months earlier. I called Mrs. Thompson's daughter, carefully explaining that we were conducting routine inventory verification and wanted to confirm she'd received her mother's ashes as scheduled. She assured me she had the urn was displayed prominently in her living room, bringing comfort to the family every day. She described the exact bronze container with matching nameplate that I was staring at in our storage facility. That afternoon, I made a decision that still troubles me. I contacted our disposal service and arranged for the extra urn to be processed through proper channels for unclaimed remains. I couldn't keep it in our active inventory when we had no legitimate record of its presence. Yet I couldn't determine how to handle something that shouldn't exist. But the next morning, Section B contained 23 urns again. The same urn, the same nameplate, the same impossible presence of someone who'd already been claimed. I recounted 3 times, reviewed the previous day's disposal documentation, confirmed that the removal had been completed properly. Yet Margaret Rose Thompson had returned to our inventory overnight. I never found an explanation for Mrs. Thompson's persistent presence in our storage facility. The extra urn appeared consistently during my morning counts, despite repeated removal and documented disposal. After the third occurrence, I stopped trying to resolve the discrepancy and simply included it in my daily inventory as special circumstances pending resolution. Mrs. Thompson's family never knew about our unusual situation. They continued to find comfort in the ashes they'd received, never suspecting that something bearing their loved one's name had taken up permanent residence in our storage facility. I never mentioned the situation to other staff members, partly from professional discretion and partly because I had no rational explanation to offer. But I think about Margaret Rose Thompson often, especially when I conduct my morning counts. Maybe some people aren't ready to leave entirely, even when their families have found peace. Maybe love creates its own kind of permanence that transcends administrative procedures and record-keeping systems. Numbers don't lie, but sometimes they don't tell the complete truth about what remains when someone dies. Sometimes the heart keeps its own inventory, independent of official records and proper procedures. And perhaps that's not a problem to solve, but a mystery to accept with the same respect we show all aspects of our work. In my storage facility, Section B will always hold 23 urns, no matter what my records indicate. Margaret Rose Thompson has claimed a permanent place in our inventory, and I've learned that some presences are stronger than paperwork, more persistent than protocol. Fire has its own logic, and sometimes it chooses not to burn. I'm Marcus, and I've operated cremation equipment for 17 years at Highland Memorial, long enough to understand that the process follows predictable patterns. Chamber temperature rises to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. Organic matter reduces to ash and bone fragments in approximately 3 hours, and what remains gets processed into the fine powder families receive. The science is reliable, the timing consistent, The outcome always the same. Until the morning I tried to cremate Mr. Benjamin Thompson. Mr. Thompson had been a firefighter for 32 years before retiring, spending his career running toward flames while others ran away. His service record spoke of countless lives saved, buildings preserved, communities protected through his courage and skill. He died peacefully in his sleep at 78, surrounded by family who spoke of his dedication to duty and his deep respect for the power of fire. I loaded Mr. Thompson into Chamber 1 at 8 a.m., following the same procedures I'd performed thousands of times before. The chamber ignited normally, gas flames burning blue, and steady as temperature gauges climbed toward operating range. I set the timer for 3 hours, recorded the start time in my log, and settled into routine equipment monitoring. But the temperature stopped climbing at 451 degrees Fahrenheit. I checked the gas flow, examined the ignition system, verified that all safety protocols were functioning correctly. Everything appeared normal, yet the chamber refused to reach cremation temperature. The flames continued burning, consuming fuel at the expected rate, but producing insufficient heat for the task at hand. I adjusted the gas mixture, increased flow rates, checked for blockages in the ventilation system. The temperature remained steady at exactly 451 degrees, as if some invisible force was preventing further heating. I'd never seen equipment malfunction in such a specific way, burning normally, but failing to produce adequate heat. By noon, I called our maintenance contractor, explaining the unusual temperature limitation. The technician who arrived found nothing wrong with Chamber 1. According to his instruments, the system was operating perfectly, generating proper heat output and maintaining correct combustion ratios. Yet my gauges continued to read 451 degrees. The technician suggested the temperature sensors might be malfunctioning, providing false readings while the chamber actually reached proper heat levels. He replaced both primary and backup sensors, calibrated the monitoring system, and verified accurate temperature measurement throughout the facility. But Chamber 1 still registered 451 degrees. We decided to transfer Mr. Thompson to Chamber 2, thinking perhaps some unknown mechanical issue was affecting the first chamber. I carefully moved his casket to the second unit, repeated all startup procedures, and initiated a new cremation cycle. Chamber 2 ignited normally, flames burning with proper intensity and color, and the temperature stopped at 451 degrees. I stood in front of the control panel, watching digital readouts that made no sense according to everything I understood about cremation equipment. 2 different chambers, recently serviced and properly maintained, both refusing to exceed the same specific temperature. The maintenance technician checked Chamber 2 with identical results, everything functioning correctly, except for heat output. By 3 p.m., I was questioning whether the problem was with our facility's gas supply, electrical systems, or some other infrastructure issue affecting both chambers. But Chamber 3, which I tested empty, reached 1800 degrees without difficulty. Only chambers containing Mr. Thompson's remains failed to achieve proper cremation temperature. I called Director Harrison, explaining the unprecedented situation. He arrived within an hour, reviewing equipment logs and observing the anomalous temperature readings personally. Together, we tried every troubleshooting procedure in our maintenance manual, contacted the chamber manufacturer for technical support, and consulted with other crematory operators who'd never encountered similar problems. As evening approached, we made the difficult decision to continue the cremation despite inadequate temperature. The process took 11 hours instead of the usual 3, extending far into the night as Chamber 1 slowly, methodically completed its work at exactly 451 degrees. I stayed throughout, monitoring the extended cycle and documenting every aspect of the unusual cremation. The final results were identical to normal temperature cremations: complete reduction to ash and bone fragments, proper consistency, appropriate weight for someone of Mr. Thompson's size. Despite the low temperature and extended duration, the process had somehow achieved the same outcome as high-heat cremation. The next morning, both chambers operated normally, reaching 1800 degrees within 30 minutes of ignition. I tested them repeatedly throughout the week, processing other cremations without incident. Whatever had caused the temperature limitation during Mr. Thompson's cremation had resolved itself completely. I researched 451 degrees Fahrenheit extensively, wondering if the number held special significance. I discovered it's the temperature at which paper ignites, the famous Fahrenheit 451 from Ray Bradbury's novel about book burning. Mr. N.T. Thompson had been a passionate reader who'd maintained extensive personal library, according to his family. But the connection seemed too coincidental to be meaningful. His memorial service was beautiful, filled with stories of heroism and dedication from fellow firefighters who'd served alongside him. They spoke of his respect for fire's power, his understanding that flames could both destroy and purify, his belief that proper handling of fire required patience and wisdom rather than force. I never mentioned the temperature anomaly to Mr. Thompson's family or colleagues. They received his ashes without knowing about the unusual cremation process, finding comfort in the familiar ritual of gathering his remains. But I think about that 11-hour cremation often, especially when I monitor chamber temperatures during routine operations. Maybe some people carry their professional knowledge beyond death, influencing the very forces they'd worked with throughout their lives. Maybe Mr. Thompson, who'd spent 32 years understanding fire's behavior, had somehow guided his own cremation according to principles I don't comprehend. Fire has its own logic, and sometimes it chooses to burn slowly, deliberately, with the patience of someone who'd learned to respect its power rather than rush its work. 451 degrees was enough for Mr. Thompson, and perhaps that tells us something about the relationship between knowledge and flame that textbooks don't teach. Schedules write themselves when the right person needs them. I'm Helen, and I've managed scheduling and reception duties at Serenity Crematory for 9 years, maintaining the careful coordination that allows families to say goodbye with dignity and peace. Our appointment book is the heart of operations. Every cremation, every family consultation, every service planned weeks in advance and recorded with meticulous attention to detail. Families depend on our reliability during their most vulnerable moments, and I take personal responsibility for ensuring nothing falls through administrative cracks. Our scheduling system uses both digital records and a handwritten backup book, a practice I instituted after experiencing computer failures that could have disrupted services. Each morning, I review both systems to confirm consistency, noting any changes or additions that might affect the day's operations. In 9 years, I'd never found an entry in the appointment book that I hadn't made myself or received from authorized staff members. Monday morning in November, I opened the appointment book to review the week's schedule and found an entry I didn't recognize. Written in blue ink between Tuesday's confirmed appointments was a notation: Elizabeth Morrison, 3 p.m., family consultation and cremation scheduling. The handwriting was neat and professional, similar to my own but subtly different in ways I couldn't immediately identify. I checked our computer system for Elizabeth Morrison, but found no corresponding digital record. No one had called to schedule services for Elizabeth Morrison. No intake forms had been completed. No family had contacted us about someone by that name. Yet the appointment was written clearly in our book, positioned precisely where Tuesday's 3 p.m. slot would logically fall. I asked my colleague Janet if she'd added any appointments to the book, but she confirmed handling only the entries I already knew about. Our director, Mr. Walsh, hadn't made the notation either, and our part-time assistant wasn't scheduled to work until Wednesday. No one on our staff had added Elizabeth Morrison to Tuesday's schedule. I studied the handwriting more carefully, comparing it to samples from our regular staff members. The script was definitely different from mine, more rounded letters, slightly larger formation, but written with the same pen I'd used for other entries. Someone had used my pen to add an appointment I hadn't authorized. Yet I kept the appointment book in my locked desk drawer when not in use. Tuesday morning arrived with normal scheduled activities proceeding as planned. I decided to treat the Elizabeth Morrison entry as a clerical error, perhaps a note I'd written while distracted and forgotten. But as 3 p.m. approached, I found myself checking the front door more frequently, wondering if someone would actually arrive for an appointment that shouldn't exist. At exactly 3 p.m., the phone rang. "Hello, this is Margaret Morrison," the caller said. "I'm calling about cremation services for my sister Elizabeth, who passed away yesterday evening. I was wondering if someone could meet with me this afternoon to discuss arrangements." I stared at the appointment book entry while speaking with Margaret Morrison, explaining that we could certainly accommodate a consultation. She mentioned she'd been caring for Elizabeth during a long illness, that her sister had specifically requested cremation, and that she hoped to schedule services as soon as possible. "Would 3 p.m. today work for you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "That would be perfect," Margaret replied. Elizabeth would have appreciated prompt attention to these matters. She was always very organized about everything. Margaret Morrison arrived precisely at 3 p.m., a dignified elderly woman carrying a folder of documents and photographs. She explained that Elizabeth had been her younger sister, unmarried and childless, who'd lived a quiet life dedicated to teaching and community service. Elizabeth had planned her own final arrangements meticulously, leaving detailed instructions for cremation and memorial preferences. The consultation proceeded normally, with Margaret providing all necessary documentation and making decisions according to Elizabeth's written wishes. She scheduled cremation for Thursday morning, selected an appropriate urn, and arranged for a small memorial service. Everything about the appointment felt routine and proper, except for the impossible fact that it had been scheduled before Elizabeth Morrison had died. After Margaret left, I examined the appointment book entry again. The ink appeared identical to other notations I'd made throughout the week, showing no signs of aging or chemical difference. The handwriting, while similar to mine, contained subtle variations I was now certain I hadn't created. Someone had written Elizabeth Morrison's appointment in my book, using my pen while predicting her death and her sister's need for services. I researched Elizabeth Morrison's obituary, which appeared in Thursday's newspaper. She'd been a retired elementary school teacher, beloved by former students and colleagues, who died peacefully at home after a brief illness. The obituary mentioned her careful planning for end-of-life arrangements and her gratitude for family support during her final weeks. Elizabeth's cremation proceeded without incident on Thursday morning. Margaret Morrison expressed satisfaction with our services and appreciation for accommodating her request for prompt attention. She mentioned that Elizabeth would have been pleased with the efficiency and respect shown throughout the process. But I never forgot the mysterious appointment entry that had appeared in our book before Elizabeth Morrison's death. I began paying closer attention to the appointment book, checking it multiple times each day for unauthorized additions. For weeks, nothing unusual appeared. Then, in December, I found another entry I hadn't made. Robert Chen, 2 p.m. Immediate cremation needed. This time, I waited without calling the number or investigating the name. At exactly 2 p.m., my phone rang. Mrs. Chen called about cremation services for her husband Robert, who died unexpectedly that morning. She needed immediate scheduling due to family traveling from overseas, and 2 p.m. was the only time she could meet that day. The pattern continued sporadically throughout the winter. Names would appear in the appointment book, written in handwriting almost identical to mine, but subtly different. Hours or days later, family members would call requesting services for the person named in the mysterious entries. The timing was always perfect, the appointments always exactly what the families needed. I stopped questioning the entries and started preparing for them. When unknown names appeared in the appointment book, I cleared the corresponding time slots and gathered intake materials in advance. The families who arrived invariably needed exactly the services suggested by the mysterious notations, and they were always grateful for our ability to accommodate their requests promptly. I never discovered who was adding names to our appointment book or how they knew when people would die and families would need services. The handwriting remained consistent but unidentifiable, and no staff member ever admitted to making the entries. The appointments continued, appearing sporadically, always accurate, always helpful. Maybe some people understand scheduling in ways that transcend normal timelines. Maybe death operates according to appointment systems we don't fully comprehend, with someone maintaining records of when families will need support and guidance. The appointment book writes itself when the right person needs services, and perhaps that's not a mystery to solve, but a gift to accept with gratitude. Schedules have their own logic, independent of our planning and preparation. Sometimes the most important appointments are the ones we never made, but somehow always keep. Smoke carries more than ash when it rises to meet the sky. I'm Ray, and I've operated cremation equipment at Valley Memorial for 14 years, watching smoke rise from our facility's stack thousands of times as families bid final farewells to their loved ones. Smoke is simply the visible result of combustion, water vapor, carbon dioxide, and trace particles released as organic matter transforms to ash. It disperses quickly into the atmosphere, colorless and odorless, when equipment functions properly. Nothing mystical, nothing meaningful, beyond the chemistry of cremation. Mrs. Lily Chang was scheduled for cremation on a Thursday morning in September. Her service timed to accommodate family traveling from 3 different states. She'd been a beloved grandmother who'd raised 6 children while working as a seamstress, known throughout her community for her kindness and her gift for storytelling. Her granddaughter mentioned that Mrs. Chang had entertained countless children over the years with elaborate shadow puppet shows, creating entire worlds with nothing but her hands and a simple light. The cremation began normally at 10 a.m., chamber temperature rising to proper levels as family members gathered in our memorial garden for a brief ceremony. Mrs. Chang's children spoke of her creativity, her endless patience with grandchildren, and her ability to find wonder in simple things. They described a woman who'd made ordinary moments magical through imagination and love. I monitored the process from our control room, occasionally glancing through the window at the facility's exhaust stack. The sky was clear and blue, with minimal wind to disperse the barely visible emissions from the cremation chamber. Everything proceeded according to standard protocol, with no unusual readings or equipment anomalies. But 45 minutes into the process, I noticed the smoke becoming more visible than usual. Not darker or denser, but somehow more defined against the pale blue sky. Instead of dispersing immediately into the atmosphere, the emissions seemed to maintain their shape for longer periods, creating distinct formations that caught my attention. At first, I dismissed the phenomenon as unusual atmospheric conditions, affecting normal dispersion patterns. But as I watched more carefully, the smoke appeared to be forming recognizable shapes, not random clouds or meaningless wisps, but deliberate formations that resembled familiar objects. I saw what looked like a small bird, wings spread in flight, holding its shape for nearly 30 seconds before dissolving. I called Mrs. Chang's granddaughter to the window, thinking she might find comfort in observing her grandmother's final journey. She stood beside me, watching the smoke rise from our facility's stack, when suddenly she gasped and pointed at the sky. "Look," she whispered. "Grandma's making her stories." The smoke had formed what appeared to be a simple house, 4 walls, and a triangular roof, rendered in white vapor against the blue background. The formation lasted almost a minute, clearly defined and unmistakably architectural, before gradually dispersing. As it faded, new shapes emerged. What looked like a tree, then a flower, then something that resembled a child's face in profile. Mrs. Chang's granddaughter was crying now, but from joy rather than grief. She explained that her grandmother had always begun her shadow puppet shows with the same sequence: a bird flying home to a house, landing in a tree beside a flower, before meeting a child who would become the hero of that day's story. The smoke formations had replicated her grandmother's opening sequence perfectly. I'd never seen atmospheric conditions create such specific, recognizable shapes from cremation emissions. The formations appeared deliberate, almost choreographed, changing from one distinct image to another, with timing that seemed too precise for random dispersion. Other staff members gathered to watch, equally amazed by the unusual phenomenon. For the remainder of the cremation process, smoke continued forming recognizable shapes, animals, objects, human figures that seemed to interact with each other in complex sequences. Mrs. Chang's family interpreted the display as their grandmother's final performance, her way of continuing the storytelling tradition that had brought joy to so many children throughout her life. I documented the incident in my equipment log, noting unusual smoke formation patterns and atmospheric dispersion characteristics. But technical language couldn't capture what we'd witnessed, a cremation that seemed to generate its own narrative, told in smoke pictures against an endless blue stage. The next day, I researched atmospheric conditions that might explain the phenomenon. I consulted meteorological data, examined wind patterns, checked for temperature inversions or humidity levels that could affect smoke dispersion. The weather had been perfectly normal for September: clear skies, gentle breezes, nothing that would account for the specific formations we'd observed. I also reviewed security footage of the cremation, hoping to capture the smoke formations on video. The cameras recorded normal emissions from our exhaust stack, showing typical dispersion patterns with no unusual shapes or extended formations. Yet multiple witnesses had seen the same detailed sequences, identifying the same recognizable figures at the same moments. Mrs. Chang's memorial service included numerous stories about her shadow puppet performances, with grandchildren recreating some of her favorite shows using techniques she'd taught them. They spoke of her belief that stories could transcend any boundary, that imagination could transform simple materials into entire universes of meaning and wonder. Over the following months, I paid closer attention to smoke patterns during cremations, wondering if Mrs. Chang's experience had been unique or part of some phenomenon I'd simply never noticed. Most cremations produced normal emissions that dispersed quickly and unremarkably, but occasionally, especially during services for people known for creativity or imagination, I observed formations that seemed too specific to be coincidental. A retired artist's cremation generated smoke that appeared to sketch abstract patterns across the sky. A musician's service produced emissions that seemed to dance rhythmically in the air. A teacher's cremation created formations that resembled letters and numbers, as if writing lessons in vapor across the heavens. I never found scientific explanations for these unusual smoke patterns. Equipment functioned normally, atmospheric conditions remained standard, and security cameras recorded nothing extraordinary. Yet the formations occurred consistently enough that I began to expect them during certain services, particularly for people who'd spent their lives creating beauty or bringing joy to others. Maybe creativity burns differently than ordinary organic matter, producing emissions that carry more than carbon and water vapor. Maybe imagination leaves traces in smoke that can form one final story against the sky, visible to those who know how to read pictures in the air. Mrs. Chang's granddaughter visits our facility occasionally, bringing flowers for the memorial garden and sometimes staying to watch other cremations. She always looks up at the smoke rising from our stack, hoping to see more stories written in white vapor against blue sky. And sometimes, when the light is right and the air is still, she smiles and points upward, seeing narratives that cameras cannot capture, but hearts can understand. Smoke carries more than ash when it rises to meet the sky. Sometimes it carries stories, told one last time by storytellers who've learned to paint with fire and write with wind. Some people keep their appointments even after they no longer need to. I'm Tom, and I handle maintenance and groundskeeping at Peaceful Valley Crematory, arriving early each morning to ensure the facility operates smoothly for families who entrust us with their final farewells. It's quiet work that suits my nature, checking equipment, maintaining buildings, keeping the memorial garden beautiful for visitors who find comfort in orderly, respectful surroundings. In 8 years, I've seen thousands of families come and go, sharing their grief and finding closure in our peaceful environment. I first noticed the elderly gentleman in the blue suit during Mrs. Anderson's service in early October. He stood apart from the family gathering, near the flagpole in our memorial garden, wearing a well-tailored navy suit and white shirt that seemed formal, even by crematory standards. I assumed he was a family friend who preferred to maintain respectful distance during the ceremony, perhaps someone who'd known Mrs. Anderson from church or community involvement. The man appeared to be in his 70s, with silver hair combed neatly and hands clasped behind his back, in a posture of patient waiting. He watched the proceedings quietly, never approaching the family or participating in conversations, maintaining his solitary vigil throughout the service. When Mrs. Anderson's family departed, the gentleman remained by the flagpole for several more minutes before walking slowly toward our main building. I was pruning roses near the entrance when he passed, and I nodded respectfully. He acknowledged my greeting with a slight smile and continued toward the facility without speaking. I assumed he was meeting with our director for scheduling or consultation, though I hadn't seen his name in our appointment book. Many people visit unscheduled to discuss future arrangements or ask questions about our services. The following week, during Mr. Patterson's cremation, I saw the same gentleman in the blue suit standing in exactly the same location, same posture, same patient demeanor, same formal attire that seemed unchanged from the previous week. Again, he watched the service from respectful distance, never interacting with family members or staff, maintaining his quiet observation until the ceremony concluded. This time, I paid closer attention as he walked toward our building. His gait was steady but slow, the measured pace of someone who understood that certain activities couldn't be rushed. I followed at discreet distance, curious about his repeated presence and formal participation in services for people who seemed unrelated. But when I reached the building entrance, the gentleman was nowhere to be seen. Our lobby was empty, the consultation rooms unoccupied, and our receptionist confirmed that no one had entered the building in the past 10 minutes. I checked the parking area for an unfamiliar vehicle but found only cars belonging to staff and the departing Patterson family. Over the following month, the gentleman appeared at every cremation service, always in the same blue suit, always standing by the flagpole, always walking toward our building afterward. I began timing his appearances, noting his arrival and departure patterns. He came only during active services, never appeared when the facility was closed or empty, and consistently maintained the same respectful distance from grieving families. I asked our receptionist if an elderly gentleman in a blue suit had ever scheduled appointments or inquired about services. She couldn't recall anyone matching his description, though she noted that many people visited for information without necessarily scheduling formal consultations. Our director had no record of meetings with anyone fitting the gentleman's appearance. In November, I decided to approach him directly. During Mrs. Chen's service, I walked over to the flagpole, where he maintained his usual vigil. Up close, his blue suit appeared perfectly pressed, his white shirt crisp and clean, his overall appearance immaculate, despite repeated wearing to outdoor services. "Excuse me," I said quietly. "I've noticed you attending our services. Are you family or friend of the people we're honoring?" He turned toward me with the same slight smile I'd seen before. "I'm waiting for my turn," he said simply, his voice soft but clear. Then, he resumed watching Mrs. Chen's ceremony, offering no further explanation. "Your turn for what?" I asked, but he didn't respond to additional questions. When Mrs. Chen's service concluded, the gentleman walked toward our building as always. This time, I followed closely, determined to see where he went. He approached the main entrance, paused at the threshold, then stepped forward and seemed to dissolve into the afternoon sunlight, not dramatically or supernaturally, but gradually, like fog dissipating in warm air. I stood at the entrance for several minutes, questioning what I'd witnessed. Heat shimmer from pavement could create optical illusions, I told myself. Fatigue or eye strain might cause perception problems, but I'd watch the gentleman disappear in broad daylight, fading from view, while I observed from just a few feet away. I began checking our security cameras after each service, reviewing footage of the memorial garden and building entrance. The cameras consistently recorded families, staff members, and normal activities, but they never showed the elderly gentleman in the blue suit, despite multiple witnesses confirming his presence during services. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband we'd cremated in October, mentioned seeing a distinguished older gentleman who'd attended the service. She'd assumed he was connected to our facility somehow, perhaps a chaplain or counselor available for families who needed additional support. Other family members made similar observations, describing the same well-dressed elderly man who maintained respectful distance during their services. But our security system recorded no trace of anyone matching their descriptions. The cameras showed flagpole areas empty during times when multiple people reported seeing the gentleman clearly. Either our equipment was malfunctioning selectively, or the gentleman existed in some way that technology couldn't detect. In December, I researched our facility's history, wondering if the gentleman might be connected to Peaceful Valley's past. I discovered that our crematory had been built on land previously occupied by a small retirement community, demolished in the 1990s to make way for our memorial park. Residents had been relocated to other facilities, but I found no records of anyone who died on the property. The gentleman continues appearing at cremation services, always in the same blue suit, always maintaining his patient vigil by the flagpole. Families occasionally mention him to staff, describing a comforting presence who seems to honor their loved ones through his respectful attendance. They find his presence reassuring rather than troubling, evidence that their family member's service was witnessed and acknowledged by the broader community. I've stopped trying to explain his appearances or document his presence through security footage. Some mysteries are more comfortable left unsolved, especially when they bring comfort rather than fear to families during difficult times. The gentleman in the blue suit has become part of our facility's routine, a constant presence who reminds us that some forms of respect transcend the boundaries between life and death. He's waiting for his turn, he said, and perhaps when that turn comes, someone else will take his place by the flagpole, maintaining the same patient vigil for families who need to know their loved ones are honored by invisible witnesses who understand the importance of final farewells. Some people keep their appointments even after they no longer need to, and maybe that's not a problem to solve, but a gift to appreciate from those who understand that presence is sometimes more valuable than explanation. Machines follow their programming until something else takes control. I'm Diana, and I've served as lead technician at Riverside Memorial Crematory for 12 years, responsible for equipment, maintenance, safety protocols, and the precise operational procedures that ensure dignity throughout the cremation process. Our facility operates on strict schedules. Chambers are activated only when needed. Systems are shut down completely at day's end, and no equipment runs unattended overnight. Safety regulations and respect for families require absolute adherence to these protocols. Our cremation chambers use computerized control systems that track every aspect of operation: ignition, timing, temperature progression, fuel consumption, ventilation cycles, and automatic shutdown sequences. Each chamber logs its activity digitally, creating permanent records I review daily to confirm proper function and identify potential maintenance needs. In 12 years, I'd never found discrepancies between log data and actual operations. Tuesday morning in January, I arrived at 6 a.m. to prepare for the day's scheduled cremations. My first task was always reviewing the previous evening's shutdown logs, confirming that all systems had deactivated properly when our facility closed. According to protocol, Chamber 3 should have shut down at 5:15 p.m. Monday evening, after completing Mr. Harrison's cremation and entering its mandatory cooling cycle, but Chamber 3 was running. I could hear the quiet hum of active ventilation. See the control panel's operational indicators glowing green. Feel the subtle warmth radiating from a chamber that should have been cold and dark. The digital display showed internal temperature at 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, full cremation heat in an empty chamber that should have been offline for 13 hours. I checked the electronic logs immediately, expecting to find evidence of malfunction or unauthorized activation. Instead, the computer showed perfect shutdown at 5:15 p.m., followed by normal cooling progression and system deactivation at 6:30 p.m. According to digital records, Chamber 3 had been completely offline since Monday evening, consuming no fuel and generating no heat. Yet the chamber was unmistakably active, burning gas and maintaining cremation temperature with no operator present and no scheduled services. I examined the manual controls, looking for signs of tampering or accidental activation, but found everything properly positioned for shutdown status. The chamber was running despite being officially offline. I initiated emergency shutdown procedures, bringing Chamber 3 to standby status and beginning the cooling sequence. The system responded normally, reducing temperature and deactivating fuel flow according to standard protocols. But the electronic logs showed no record of the shutdown I'd just performed, maintaining that the chamber had never been active since Monday evening. I called our equipment manufacturer's technical support line, explaining the apparent discrepancy between logged data and actual chamber status. The technician who reviewed our system remotely found no evidence of overnight operation, no record of fuel consumption, no indication that Chamber 3 had been active since its properly documented shutdown the previous day. Your logs show perfect operation and normal shutdown, he confirmed. Are you certain the chamber was actually running this morning? I was certain. I'd felt the heat, seen the operational indicators, heard the ventilation system working, but our computer system insisted Chamber 3 had been offline all night, and diagnostic tests revealed no malfunctions or irregular conditions. The technician suggested possible sensor errors or display malfunctions, scheduling an on-site inspection for later in the week. Wednesday morning, I arrived early again and found Chamber 1 active and heated to operating temperature. The electronic logs showed proper shutdown Tuesday evening and no overnight activity, yet the chamber hummed with fully operational systems. This time, I documented everything, carefully photographing control panels, recording temperature readings, measuring fuel consumption in real time. The fuel consumption data was particularly troubling. Chamber 1 was burning gas at normal operational rates, yet our utility meters showed no corresponding usage. According to building systems, no fuel had been consumed overnight, despite clear evidence of active cremation equipment. The chamber was somehow running without drawing power or gas from our supply lines. I called Director Morrison immediately, explaining the impossible situation developing with our equipment. He arrived within 30 minutes, observing Chamber 1's active status personally and reviewing the contradictory electronic logs. Together, we initiated shutdown procedures and began systematic inspection of all safety systems. Have you scheduled any overnight services? Morrison asked, though he knew our facility never operated unattended. Nothing scheduled, and no remains in any chamber, I confirmed. The chambers are activating themselves somehow, reaching full cremation temperature with nothing to process. Thursday morning brought the same phenomenon with Chamber 2. Friday, Chamber 3 again. Each morning, a different chamber was active and heated. Each night's logs showed perfect shutdown, with no overnight activity. Our equipment was operating according to some schedule I hadn't programmed, following protocols that existed nowhere in our documentation. The weekend brought no relief. Saturday morning, all 3 chambers were active simultaneously, humming with coordinated operation, despite being officially offline since Friday evening. The building felt warm despite January cold, heated by equipment that consumed no logged fuel while maintaining impossible temperatures. Monday's on-site inspection found our equipment in perfect condition. The technician tested every system, reviewed all programming, examined hardware and software components thoroughly. Everything functioned exactly as designed, with no evidence of malfunction or unauthorized modification. The chambers operated properly during normal hours and shut down correctly each evening. But Tuesday morning, Chamber 1 was active again. I stopped trying to explain the overnight activations and began accepting them as part of our facility's routine. Each morning, I would find one or more chambers heated and ready for use, despite official logs showing continuous shutdown. I documented the discrepancies but stopped calling for technical support or equipment inspection. The pattern continued through winter and into spring. Chambers activated themselves according to some unknown schedule, maintaining perfect cremation temperatures while consuming no recorded fuel. The phenomenon caused no operational problems during business hours. Equipment functioned normally for scheduled services, shut down properly each evening, and displayed no signs of stress or malfunction. But families began commenting on the unusual warmth they felt in our facility, especially during early morning services. They described a comforting heat that seemed to welcome them, an atmosphere of readiness that suggested our crematory was prepared to honor their loved ones with immediate attention and care. Mrs. Patterson mentioned feeling embraced by warmth during her husband's 8 a.m. service, as if the building itself was offering comfort during her difficult morning. Mr. Chen noted that the crematory felt ready and waiting when he arrived for his mother's 9 a.m. cremation, prepared to provide the respectful care his family needed. I never discovered why our chambers activate themselves overnight, or how they maintain operation without consuming recorded fuel. The equipment continues its mysterious schedule, preparing for services according to programming that exists beyond human control. Each morning brings heated chambers and operational systems, ready to serve families who trust us with their final farewells. Maybe some facilities develop their own understanding of readiness, independent of human scheduling and mechanical programming. Maybe our crematory has learned to anticipate the needs of families who will arrive, seeking comfort and closure, preparing itself during quiet overnight hours when no one is watching. Machines follow their programming until something else takes control. And perhaps that something else understands better than we do what it means to be ready, to offer warmth and welcome to people facing the coldest moments of their lives. Our chambers continue their overnight vigil, heating themselves for families they haven't met but somehow know they'll serve. And I've learned that some preparations happen beyond our protocols, guided by purposes more compassionate than any programming we could design. Voices carry farther than sound waves when they have something important to say. I'm Pete, and I've operated cremation equipment at Heritage Memorial for 15 years, long enough to know that silence is the natural state of our work. The chambers burn quietly, ventilation systems hum softly, and families speak in hushed tones that reflect the solemnity of final farewells. Even our building seems designed to absorb sound, creating an atmosphere of peaceful reverence that helps people process their grief without distraction. The only voices in our facility should belong to staff members, visiting families, and occasional maintenance personnel. Our chambers are soundproof by design, containing the intense heat and combustion process within insulated walls that prevent any noise from escaping. In 15 years of operation, I'd never heard anything from inside an active cremation chamber, except the controlled rush of flames and the mechanical rhythm of air circulation, until I began cremating people who'd immigrated to our country from distant places. Mr. Giuseppe Rossetti was the first. He'd arrived from Italy 60 years earlier, built a successful restaurant business, and raised 4 children who spoke of his pride in becoming an American citizen while maintaining deep love for his homeland. During his cremation on a quiet Tuesday morning, I was monitoring Chamber 2 when I heard something that made me pause in my routine equipment checks. Voices, faint but unmistakable, coming from inside the active chamber. I pressed my ear against the chamber door, listening carefully to what sounded like multiple people speaking in a language I couldn't identify. The voices were soft, conversational, neither distressed nor celebratory, just the natural rhythm of people talking together. They continued for several minutes before fading into the normal sounds of cremation. I checked our audio monitoring system, which records ambient sound levels for safety purposes. The recordings showed normal operational noise, with no indication of human voices or unusual acoustic activity. Yet I'd clearly heard people speaking inside a chamber that should have contained only Mr. Rossetti's remains and the controlled environment of cremation. The following week, during Mrs. Fan's service, I heard voices again. Mrs. Fan had fled Vietnam as a young woman, eventually settling in our community where she'd worked as a seamstress and raised 3 children. The voices during her cremation sounded different from Mr. Rossetti's experience, a different language, different rhythmic patterns, but the same conversational quality that suggested people talking peacefully together. I began paying closer attention during cremations for people who'd immigrated from other countries. Not every service produced voices, but they occurred frequently enough to establish a pattern. Mrs. Kowalski from Poland, Mr. Santos from Brazil, Dr. Petrov from Russia. Each cremation was accompanied by faint voices, speaking in languages I couldn't understand, but somehow recognized as connected to their countries of origin. The voices never sounded distressed or frightening. Instead, they carried the warm familiarity of people greeting someone they hadn't seen in years, the comfortable chatter of family gatherings or community celebrations. I began to think of them as welcome committees, groups of people somehow gathering to accompany immigrants on their final journey home. I researched our audio monitoring equipment, wondering if electromagnetic interference or unusual acoustic properties might explain the phenomenon. Our technical specifications indicated that chamber walls should prevent any sound transmission, and our recording equipment was calibrated to detect even subtle audio anomalies. Yet the voices occurred consistently without registering on any of our monitoring systems. In September, Mrs. Chen's cremation provided the most extended vocal activity I'd experienced. She'd arrived from China 45 years earlier, working multiple jobs to support her family, while learning English and eventually becoming a naturalized citizen. During her cremation, voices continued for nearly an hour, sometimes single speakers, sometimes what sounded like large groups, all speaking in what I assumed was Chinese. The conversation seemed joyful, punctuated by what sounded like laughter and exclamations of pleasure. Mrs. Chen's daughter mentioned that her mother had always talked about reuniting with family members who'd remained in China, people she'd left behind decades earlier and never seen again. The voices during her cremation suggested such a reunion might have occurred. I never heard voices during cremations for people born in our country, regardless of their ethnicity or family background. The phenomenon occurred only with first-generation immigrants, people who'd made the difficult journey from distant homelands to build new lives in unfamiliar places. It was as if their cremations activated some form of international communication system that connected them with voices from their origins. Mr. O'Brien's cremation in October was particularly moving. He'd left Ireland during the troubles of the 1970s, arriving in America with nothing but determination and hope for a better future. His family spoke of his homesickness, his stories about the green hills of County Cork, his dream of returning someday to visit the places he'd left behind. The voices during his cremation carried what sounded like Irish accents, speaking in rhythms and intonations that matched the way Mr. O'Brien had told stories about his homeland. His son mentioned afterward that the crematory had felt unusually warm and welcoming, as if his father was being received by a gathering of old friends who had been waiting to see him again. I began documenting the voice phenomena in a private log, noting which cremations produced vocal activity and attempting to identify the languages involved. The pattern remained consistent. First-generation immigrants were accompanied by voices speaking their native languages, while cremations for American-born individuals proceeded in normal silence. Dr. Yuki Tanaka's service provided the clearest vocal activity I'd recorded. She'd immigrated from Japan as a young medical student, eventually becoming a respected pediatrician who delivered hundreds of babies in our community. During her cremation, voices spoke in what sounded like Japanese. but with such clarity that I could distinguish individual speakers and emotional tone. The conversation sounded celebratory, filled with expressions that seemed to welcome Dr. Tanaka and acknowledge her accomplishments. Her family had mentioned her pride in maintaining Japanese traditions while embracing American opportunities, her belief that people could honor their heritage while building new identities in adopted countries. I never found scientific explanations for the voices I heard during immigrant cremations. Audio equipment functioned normally, chamber acoustics remained unchanged, and no technical factors could account for the phenomena. Yet the voices continued occurring with enough consistency that I began expecting them during services for first-generation immigrants. Maybe death removes the barriers that separate us from the places we've left behind. Maybe immigrants carry invisible connections to their homelands that activate during final transitions, allowing them to hear voices from across oceans and decades. The conversations always sounded like homecomings, people welcoming travelers who'd been away for far too long. Mrs. Rodriguez's cremation last month produced the most beautiful vocal activity I'd experienced. She'd arrived from Mexico 50 years earlier, working in fields and factories to support her family, while never losing her love for the mountains and villages of her childhood. During her cremation, voices sang what sounded like traditional Mexican songs, harmonies that filled the chamber with music instead of conversation. Her granddaughter mentioned that Mrs. Rodriguez had always believed death would take her home to the places she'd never stopped missing. The songs during her cremation suggested she might have been right, that some journeys end where they began, guided by voices that never stopped calling across the distance. Voices carry farther than sound waves when they have something important to say. And maybe the most important things they say are welcome home to people who've spent their lives building bridges between the places they left and the places they found. Flowers have their own language when no one is watching them speak. I'm Kim, and I work as crematory assistant at Tranquil Gardens Memorial, helping families through the practical details of saying goodbye while maintaining the beautiful environment they deserve during difficult times. Part of my responsibilities include caring for floral arrangements families bring to honor their loved ones, ensuring bouquets stay fresh, arrangements remain dignified, and memorial displays reflect the love and respect families want to express through flowers. Our facility encourages families to bring flowers that held special meaning for the deceased. Gardens, roses from a grandmother's backyard, wildflowers from a favorite hiking trail, elaborate arrangements that capture personalities and passions. I've learned that flowers tell stories about relationships, memories, and the unique ways people touched each other's lives. Caring for these floral tributes is both practical work and emotional privilege. Each evening, I review all flower arrangements, removing wilted blooms, refreshing water, and repositioning displays to maintain their beauty for the following day's visitors. Families often return multiple times during the days following cremation, finding comfort in seeing their floral tributes properly maintained and respectfully displayed. The work requires attention to detail and understanding that small gestures matter enormously during grief. In March, I began noticing subtle changes in flower arrangements that I couldn't explain through normal horticultural processes. Nothing dramatic or immediately obvious, just slight alterations in positioning that suggested someone had been adjusting displays during overnight hours when our facility was closed and secured. Mrs. Patterson's memorial featured a mixed arrangement of roses, lilies, and baby's breath that her daughter had created from flowers grown in the family garden. I positioned the display in our memorial alcove Tuesday evening, ensuring proper lighting and stable placement. Wednesday morning, I found the flowers rearranged in a perfect circle, with roses forming the outer ring and lilies creating an inner pattern around a center of baby's breath. The arrangement was more beautiful than my original positioning, more balanced and visually pleasing. But I hadn't made the changes, and no staff member had reason to adjust floral displays overnight. Our facility was locked and secured, with no authorized personnel entering the building. Between evening closure and morning opening. I assumed a family member had requested access to modify the arrangement, though we had no record of such visits. Our policy allowed families to adjust their own floral tributes with staff approval, and perhaps someone had made changes I'd simply forgotten to document. I made a note to ask Mrs. Patterson's daughter about the rearrangement, but when I called, she expressed surprise at my description. She hadn't visited the facility since leaving the flowers Tuesday afternoon, and no other family member had requested access to the memorial area. She was pleased to hear the arrangement looked beautiful, but confirmed that no one from their family had modified the display. The following week, Mr. Chen's memorial flowers underwent similar overnight changes. His family had brought white chrysanthemums and red carnations arranged in a traditional rectangular display. Thursday evening, I positioned the arrangement according to their wishes. Friday morning, the flowers had been reorganized into a perfect cross pattern, with white chrysanthemums forming the vertical line and red carnations creating the horizontal beam. Again, the new arrangement was more striking than the original positioning, more symbolic and emotionally resonant. Mr. Chen's family was moved by what they interpreted as a spiritual sign, evidence that their loved one was somehow participating in his own memorial display. They asked who had created such a meaningful arrangement, but I had no explanation to offer. I began documenting flower positions more carefully, taking photographs of arrangements each evening and comparing them to morning configurations. The changes occurred regularly, but unpredictably. Not every memorial was affected, but those that changed showed clear, intentional repositioning, rather than random displacement or natural settling. Mrs. Garcia's funeral flowers provided the most dramatic transformation I'd witnessed. Her family had brought dozens of arrangements representing different relationships and memories: roses from her garden, sunflowers from her kitchen table, wildflowers she'd gathered during nature walks. I arranged them throughout the memorial area according to family instructions, creating a natural garden atmosphere they'd requested. Saturday night, I photographed the complete display before leaving the facility. Sunday morning, every arrangement had been repositioned to create geometric patterns, circles, triangles, straight lines that transformed the random garden effect into something that resembled mathematical precision. The flowers maintained their natural beauty, while organizing themselves into shapes that suggested deliberate artistic intention. The geometric patterns were stunning, more visually impactful than anything I could have designed myself. But they required moving dozens of arrangements, repositioning heavy vases and delicate displays with skill that would have taken hours to complete. No one had been in the building overnight, yet someone or something had redesigned the entire memorial area. I started taking photographs throughout the day, documenting how arrangements looked at different times to identify when changes occurred. The modifications always happened between final evening inspection and first morning arrival, during hours when the facility was empty and secure. Security cameras showed no unusual activity, no people entering the memorial areas or adjusting floral displays. Mrs. Thompson's memorial provided insight into possible patterns behind the rearrangements. Her family had brought flowers representing different stages of her life: baby roses for her children, mature blooms for her marriage, wildflowers for her love of nature. I arranged them chronologically around her memorial space, telling the story of her life through floral progression. The next morning, the flowers had been reorganized by color rather than chronology. All white flowers grouped together, followed by pink, then red, then yellow, creating a rainbow effect that was beautiful but destroyed the biographical narrative her family had intended. The change suggested someone was responding to visual rather than emotional criteria, organizing according to aesthetic principles rather than personal meaning. I began experimenting with different arrangement styles, wondering if I could influence the overnight modifications. Simple displays remained unchanged, but complex arrangements with multiple flower types consistently underwent reorganization. The changes always improved visual balance and geometric harmony, suggesting someone with sophisticated understanding of floral design was making the modifications. Dr. Patel's memorial flowers presented the most puzzle piece evidence I'd collected. His family brought marigolds, which held religious significance in their tradition, arranged in patterns that reflected cultural symbolism. I positioned them according to the family's specific instructions, maintaining their spiritual and aesthetic intentions. The marigolds were rearranged overnight into a perfect mandala pattern, concentric circles radiating from a central point, creating symmetry that enhanced rather than contradicted the family's religious intentions. The new arrangement was more beautiful and spiritually resonant than the original positioning, suggesting whoever made the changes understood cultural significance as well as visual principles. I never discovered who was rearranging flower displays or how they gained access to secured areas without triggering security systems. The modifications continued occurring sporadically, always improving arrangements while respecting the essential meaning families had invested in their floral tributes. Maybe flowers attract attention from forces that understand beauty better than human planning can achieve. Maybe memorial displays call to artistic spirits who can't resist improving what loving hands have created. The overnight rearrangements always enhanced rather than diminished the emotional impact of family tributes, suggesting that whoever made the changes shared our commitment to honoring the deceased through beautiful memorial environments. Mrs. Wilson's cremation last week produced the most beautiful floral transformation I've witnessed. Her family brought wildflower arrangements she'd gathered herself during final months, wanting her memorial to reflect her lifelong love of natural beauty. I arranged them randomly throughout the space, creating the informal garden atmosphere she would have preferred. Monday morning, the wildflowers had been organized into a perfect spiral pattern that drew the eye naturally toward the center where Mrs. Wilson's photograph was displayed. The arrangement maintained the natural, informal quality she loved, while creating focus and visual movement that honored her as the central figure in her own memorial space. Her daughter wept when she saw the transformation, interpreting it as evidence that her mother was somehow participating in her own farewell ceremony. And perhaps she was. Maybe love expresses itself through beauty that transcends physical limitations, creating arrangements that speak louder than words about the people we've lost and the ways they continue touching our lives. Flowers have their own language when no one is watching them speak, and sometimes the most beautiful messages are written in petals by hands we cannot see, but hearts we can still feel. Some deliveries arrive before anyone places the order. I'm Director Walsh, and I've managed Serenity Memorial Crematory for 13 years, overseeing every aspect of operations, from initial family consultations through final disposition of remains. Our delivery system is carefully controlled. Ashes are released only to authorized family members, transported by verified personnel, and documented through multiple checkpoints that ensure proper handling throughout the process. In 13 years, I'd never experienced confusion about ash delivery or questions about our transportation procedures. Our policy requires families to collect cremated remains in person or designate authorized representatives with proper documentation. We don't offer home delivery except in exceptional circumstances involving disability or geographic distance, and such arrangements require extensive paperwork and family confirmation. Every ash pickup is logged with signatures, identification, verification, and detailed records that protect families from administrative errors. Thursday morning in November, I received a call that made me question our entire documentation system. Mrs. Helen Henderson called to ask why her husband's ashes had been delivered to her home when she hadn't requested delivery service. According to her account, a professional-looking gentleman had arrived at her door Wednesday evening with a bronze urn bearing her husband's name and our facility's identification. "I don't understand how this happened," she said. "I was planning to pick up Robert's ashes this weekend, but they're already here." The delivery man was very respectful, but I didn't arrange for home delivery. I checked our records immediately. Robert Henderson's ashes were listed as ready for pickup, stored in our designated family collection area. According to our logs, no delivery had been scheduled, no authorization had been granted, and no transportation arrangements had been made. Yet Mrs. Henderson had received an urn bearing her husband's name through a delivery we hadn't provided. I walked to our storage area to verify Mr. Henderson's status and found his urn exactly where it should be, properly labeled, correctly positioned, undisturbed since completion of cremation. The nameplate matched our records perfectly, and the urn showed no signs of having been moved or replaced. Yet Mrs. Henderson clearly had an identical urn at her home. I drove to the Henderson residence to examine the delivered urn personally. Mrs. Henderson showed me a bronze container, identical to the one in our storage facility. Same model, same engraving style, same professional appearance. The nameplate read, Robert William Henderson, in our standard font, with dates matching our records exactly. Even the weight felt appropriate for someone of Mr. Henderson's size. Can you describe the delivery person? I asked, though I knew we hadn't authorized any delivery. Middle-aged man in a dark suit. Mrs. Henderson replied, very professional, very respectful. He said he was from Serenity Memorial and handed me the urn with a sympathy card. I assumed you'd arranged delivery as a courtesy service. I had no explanation for the mysterious delivery. Our staff hadn't performed any unauthorized transportation. Our records showed no delivery arrangements, and Mr. Henderson's ashes remained securely stored at our facility. Yet Mrs. Henderson possessed what appeared to be legitimate cremated remains in a professional container bearing all appropriate identification. I examined both urns carefully, comparing weight, appearance, and construction details. They were identical in every respect, same manufacturer, same finish, same engraving quality. The contents felt similarly distributed, suggesting both containers held appropriate amounts of cremated remains. But Robert Henderson had been cremated once, producing one set of ashes that should have resulted in one urn. Mrs. Henderson was understandably confused, but not distressed by the situation. She'd interpreted the unexpected delivery as thoughtful service from our facility, evidence that we cared enough about families to provide convenient home transportation. She was grateful rather than concerned, appreciating what she perceived as exceptional customer care during her difficult time. I faced an impossible decision about how to handle duplicate urns containing what appeared to be the same person's remains. I couldn't retrieve the delivered urn without causing Mrs. Henderson additional distress during her grief process. But I couldn't explain how two identical containers had been created from a single cremation, or who had authorization to deliver ashes we hadn't released. I decided to allow Mrs. Henderson to keep the delivered urn while maintaining the original urn in our storage facility. If questions arose later, I would address them through proper administrative channels. But privately, I began investigating whether equipment malfunctions or procedural errors could have resulted in duplicate ash containers. Our cremation logs showed normal processing for Mr. Henderson's service. Single casket loaded, standard temperature progression, appropriate duration, expected ash weight collected, no anomalies, no unusual circumstances, no indication that extra remains had been produced or additional containers had been filled. I contacted our urn supplier to verify recent deliveries, wondering if someone had obtained unauthorized containers bearing our facility's identification. But our orders matched our inventory perfectly, with no missing urns or unexplained acquisitions. Every container was accounted for through normal business channel. The following week, I received another call about unexpected ash delivery. Mr. Patterson's daughter called to thank us for the thoughtful home delivery of her father's ashes, which she'd received from a very professional gentleman who'd arrived without prior arrangement. Again, our records showed no authorized delivery, and Mr. Patterson's ashes remained in our storage facility. The pattern continued monthly through winter and into spring. Families called to acknowledge receipt of ashes they hadn't requested for home delivery, describing identical professional delivery personnel and expressing gratitude for service we hadn't provided. In each case, our storage facility contained the original urns, while families possessed what appeared to be identical containers delivered through mysterious channels. I stopped investigating the unauthorized deliveries and began accepting them as part of our facility's unexplained operational procedures. Families were consistently pleased with the convenient service, interpreting the deliveries as evidence of our commitment to customer care and attention to their needs during difficult times. Mrs. Chen expressed particular appreciation for the home delivery of her mother's ashes, explaining that her own mobility limitations had made facility pickup challenging. She'd been wondering how to arrange transportation when the delivery gentleman appeared at her door with professional courtesy and appropriate sympathy. The timing had been perfect for her family's needs. Dr. Morrison's family was equally grateful when his ashes arrived unexpectedly at their home. They'd been planning a weekend trip to collect his remains, but were able to include the urn in their travel plans immediately due to the convenient delivery timing. The service had exceeded their expectations and demonstrated genuine care for their family's circumstances. I never discovered who was providing unauthorized ash deliveries, or how they obtained access to cremated remains we hadn't released. The delivery person was consistently described as professional, respectful, and appropriately dressed, suggesting someone with understanding of funeral industry protocols and family sensitivity requirements. Maybe some services operate beyond administrative authorization, provided by forces that understand family needs better than paperwork can document. Maybe the most important deliveries are the ones that arrive exactly when people need them, regardless of whether anyone remembers placing the order. Our facility continues maintaining proper storage and pickup procedures, while mysterious deliveries provide convenient alternatives for families who benefit from home service. I've learned to accept the dual system as evidence that customer care sometimes transcends official policies, guided by understanding that goes beyond bureaucratic procedures. Mrs. Anderson's recent delivery was particularly meaningful to her family. Her ashes arrived on her birthday, allowing her children to honor the anniversary with immediate memorial arrangements, rather than waiting for scheduled pickup. The timing felt intentional rather than coincidental, as if someone understood the emotional significance of specific dates in family grieving processes. Some deliveries arrive before anyone places the order, guided by knowledge of what families need and when they need it. And perhaps that's not a problem to solve, but a service to appreciate, provided by delivery personnel who understand that timing matters more than paperwork when people are processing the loss of someone they love. Our return policy has expanded to include services we don't officially provide, delivered by personnel we don't officially employ, for reasons we don't officially understand. But the families who receive these mysterious deliveries find exactly what they need, exactly when they need it, and sometimes that's more valuable than administrative clarity. Some doors open for visitors who don't need permission to enter. I'm Robert, and I've worked night security at Memorial Gardens Crematory for 7 years, maintaining vigilant protection of our facility during overnight hours when families trust us to safeguard their loved ones' remains and memorial spaces. It's solitary work that requires attention to detail, respect for the solemn environment we protect, and understanding that security involves more than preventing unauthorized access. It means preserving the dignity and peace families expect from our sacred spaces. Our facility operates strict access control, with electronic locks programmed to prevent entry outside normal business hours. Only authorized personnel carry key cards that can override security systems, and all access is logged electronically with timestamps and identification records. In 7 years of night shifts, I'd never experienced lock malfunctions or security breaches that couldn't be explained through equipment failure or human error. The electronic locks function on timer systems that automatically secure all entrances at 6 p.m. and remain locked until staff arrival the following morning. Emergency override codes allow authorized access during security situations, but such overrides trigger immediate alerts and require detailed incident documentation. The system had operated flawlessly since installation, providing reliable protection for families who trusted us with their most precious final possessions. Tuesday evening in October, I was conducting my normal perimeter inspection when I noticed the main entrance door standing slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough to indicate that the electronic lock had failed to engage properly during evening closing procedures. I checked the access log, which showed normal lockdown at 6 p.m., with no subsequent activity or override attempts. I secured the door manually and tested the electronic lock system, which functioned normally through multiple activation cycles. The mechanism appeared to be working correctly, engaging and disengaging with proper mechanical precision. I documented the incident as possible equipment malfunction and continued my security rounds, checking all other entrances for similar problems. The following Tuesday at exactly 11:47 p.m., I observed the main entrance unlock itself. I was reviewing security monitors when the door's status indicator changed from secure to open, accompanied by the quiet click of electronic lock disengagement. The access log showed no authorization code, no keycard activation, no manual override command. The door simply unlocked autonomously. I approached the entrance cautiously, expecting to find mechanical malfunction or electrical interference affecting the lock mechanism. But the door opened smoothly and remained unlocked, allowing unrestricted access to our facility. I tested the lock manually and found it functioning normally, engaging and disengaging according to proper commands. I reset the lock and documented the incident, noting the specific time and circumstances of the unauthorized opening. But the following Tuesday at 11:47 p.m., the door unlocked again. Same time, same autonomous disengagement, same lack of logged authorization or mechanical explanation. I began positioning myself near the main entrance each Tuesday evening, monitoring the door directly rather than relying on electronic surveillance. At 11:47 p.m., I watched the lock mechanism disengage with quiet precision, status lights changing from red to green as the door became accessible to anyone who might want to enter. I started staying by the door after it unlocked, curious about whether anyone would take advantage of the mysterious access opportunity. For several weeks, nothing happened. The door opened punctually but remained unused, standing accessible but unvisited until I manually reset the lock around midnight. Then I began seeing them, faint figures moving through the facility's corridors, translucent forms that seemed to flow rather than walk through our memorial spaces. Not frightening or threatening, but gentle presences that moved with purpose and familiarity, as if they belonged in our facility and understood its layout intimately. The figures appeared consistently after the Tuesday night door opening, arriving individually or in small groups through the unlocked entrance. They moved quietly through our building, pausing at memorial displays, spending time in areas where families had said goodbye to loved ones, gathering in our main ceremonial space, as if attending services we hadn't scheduled. I watched them from discreet distances, fascinated by their obvious respect for our facility's sacred atmosphere. They never disturbed memorial arrangements, never interfered with equipment or displays, never caused any damage or disruption. They simply moved through our building like visitors paying respects at a place that held special meaning for them. The figures varied in appearance. Some appeared elderly, others younger, some in formal attire appropriate for memorial services, others in casual clothing that suggested comfort rather than ceremony. But they all shared the same translucent quality that made them visible yet insubstantial, present but not entirely physical. I tried following individual figures to observe their activities more closely, but they seemed to dissolve when approached directly. They were clearly visible from distance but faded from sight when I moved within 10 or 15 feet of their locations. They existed in some middle ground between presence and absence, visible enough to observe but elusive enough to avoid direct contact. The weekly gatherings continued throughout autumn and into winter. Each Tuesday at 11:47 p.m., the door unlocked itself, and translucent visitors entered our facility for what appeared to be informal memorial services or remembrance gatherings. They moved through our spaces with obvious familiarity, suggesting they'd been connected to our facility or to people we'd served. I began recognizing some of the regular visitors, an elderly woman in a blue dress who always paused at our memorial garden entrance, a middle-aged man in a suit who spent time near our ceremonial podium, a younger woman who seemed drawn to our display of family photographs. They appeared weekly, with clockwork consistency, maintaining their own schedule of remembrance and respect. In December, I noticed that our facility felt warmer during the Tuesday night gatherings, not dramatically, but noticeably more comfortable than other winter evenings. The visitors seemed to bring their own atmosphere of warmth and community, transforming our empty building into a space filled with invisible fellowship and shared memory. I stopped trying to understand the scientific basis for the weekly door opening, or the translucent visitors who took advantage of the access opportunity. The phenomenon caused no security problems, created no safety concerns, and actually seemed to enhance rather than diminish the respectful atmosphere our families expected from our facility. Mrs. Patterson visited our facility the Wednesday morning after one of the Tuesday gatherings, mentioning that the building felt especially peaceful and welcoming. She'd come to spend quiet time thinking about her husband, and she commented that our facility seemed to retain some quality of comfort and community that made her feel less alone in her grief. Other families made similar observations about the particularly welcoming atmosphere they sometimes encountered, especially on Wednesday mornings after Tuesday evening security openings. They described feeling embraced by warmth and fellowship that suggested their loved ones were surrounded by caring community even after death. I never reported the Tuesday night door openings to facility management or requested technical investigation of the lock malfunction. The visitors who took advantage of the weekly access were clearly connected to our facility's purpose, attending memorial gatherings that honored rather than disturbed the sacred work we performed for grieving families. Maybe some doors open for visitors who don't need permission to enter, people who understand the importance of gathering places and memorial communities that transcend physical limitations. Maybe our facility serves purposes beyond official business hours, providing space for remembrance gatherings that occur according to schedules we don't control but somehow support. The Tuesday night visitors continue their weekly gatherings, entering through doors that unlock themselves, and participating in memorial services we don't officially host. And perhaps that's not a security breach to prevent, but a community service to protect. Evidence that some forms of respect and remembrance operate beyond normal business hours and official procedures. Operating hours expand to accommodate visitors who need access to sacred spaces, regardless of posted schedules. And sometimes the most important gatherings are the ones that happen when no one is officially watching, attended by people who understand that memorial communities include members we can see and others we can only sense, moving quietly through spaces dedicated to memory and love. Sometimes the most personal requests come from people who can no longer speak for themselves. I'm Anne, and I've managed Memorial Gardens Crematory for 16 years, coordinating countless services that honor individual lives while providing comfort to grieving families. Every detail matters during final farewells music selection, ceremonial timing, memorial displays, and personal touches that reflect unique relationships and shared memories. Families often make special requests that help them process grief while celebrating the distinctive qualities that made their loved ones irreplaceable. Our facility encourages personalization through music choices that held special meaning for the deceased. We maintain extensive sound equipment and music libraries, allowing families to incorporate songs that capture personalities, represent relationships, or provide emotional comfort during difficult ceremonies. Whether classical compositions, popular songs, religious hymns, or recordings of personal significance, music often becomes the most powerful element of memorial services. I installed a suggestion box in our reception area 3 years ago, encouraging families to share feedback about our services and ideas for improvement. The wooden box sits discreetly near our memorial display, available for anonymous comments from people who might feel uncomfortable expressing concerns or suggestions directly to staff members. Most submissions are brief notes of appreciation or practical suggestions about facility operations. In September, I found an unusual note in the suggestion box that made me reconsider the source of our feedback submissions. Written in neat handwriting on plain white paper was a specific music request. Please play Moon River during tomorrow's cremation service. It was our song, and she would want to hear it one more time. No cremation was scheduled for the following day, and I had no record of families requesting Moon River for any upcoming services. The note provided no signature, no contact information, no indication of which family member had made the request. I filed it with other general suggestions, assuming it was intended for future reference when appropriate services were scheduled. But Tuesday morning, Mrs. Dorothy Williams arrived for an unscheduled consultation about cremation services for her recently deceased husband. During our conversation, she mentioned that Moon River had been their special song, played at their wedding 45 years earlier, and throughout their marriage, whenever they needed to remember their love for each other. I'd like to include it in his service, she said. Harold would want to hear our song one more time. I retrieved the anonymous note from my files, comparing the handwriting to Mrs. Williams' signature on our paperwork. The script was different, more flowing, more deliberate, written with obvious care and attention to each letter. Mrs. Williams hadn't written the request, yet someone had known she would want Moon River for her husband's service before she'd even contacted our facility. The following week, I found another note in the suggestion box. Please consider Amazing Grace for the Thursday service. She found great comfort in that hymn during her final days. Thursday's scheduled cremation was for Mrs. Proplin, Elizabeth Hawthorne, whose daughter had planned to request secular music that reflected her mother's love of nature and gardening. But when Mrs. Hawthorne's daughter arrived for final arrangements, she mentioned discovering her mother's Bible with numerous notations next to Amazing Grace. Her mother had apparently found special meaning in the hymn during her illness, though she'd never expressed particular religious feelings previously. I think she'd want to hear Amazing Grace during her service, the daughter said. It seems to have meant something special to her at the end. I began paying closer attention to the anonymous notes appearing in our suggestion box, documenting their contents and comparing them to actual family requests. The pattern was consistent, specific. Music suggestions appeared days before families made identical requests, written in handwriting that never matched the family members who eventually asked for the same songs. The notes demonstrated intimate knowledge of personal relationships and musical preferences that only close family members should possess. In the Garden, for a woman who'd maintained prize-winning roses. Fly Me to the Moon for a retired pilot. Danny Boy for an Irish immigrant who'd never lost his accent. Each suggestion perfectly matched the eventual family requests, yet none were written by the people who made those requests. Mrs. Patterson's note was particularly detailed. Please play the recording of You Are My Sunshine that she used to sing to her grandchildren. The version with her voice would mean everything to the family. I had no recording of Mrs. Patterson's singing, and her obituary made no mention of musical activities or family performances. But when her daughter arrived for arrangements, she brought a cassette tape containing recordings her mother had made for the grandchildren, bedtime songs and lullabies that included a beautiful version of You Are My Sunshine. The daughter had forgotten about the recordings until discovering them while going through her mother's belongings. Mom would want the children to hear her voice one more time, she said, asking if we could play the personal recording during the service. The handwriting on Mrs. Patterson's note was different from all previous suggestions, more delicate, more feminine, but still not matching any family member's script. Someone was writing music requests in handwriting that seemed to reflect the personality of the deceased person themselves, as if they were somehow communicating their final musical preferences directly. I began examining the handwriting more systematically, comparing notes to signature samples from medical records, insurance documents, and personal papers families provided during arrangements. The correlation was unsettling but undeniable. Each anonymous music request was written in handwriting, that closely resembled the deceased person's own script, though with subtle differences that suggested someone learning to write in an unfamiliar style. Mr. Thompson's note requested, "How great thou art," in handwriting that matched samples from his personal correspondence, complete with his distinctive letter formations and pen pressure patterns. Mrs. Chen's suggestion for Chinese folk songs was written in characters that resembled her own calligraphy, though rendered with slightly less precision than her original writing samples. The requests became more complex and emotionally specific as autumn progressed. Dr. Rodriguez's note included detailed instructions. "Please play the mariachi version of Cielito Lindo that we danced to at our wedding. Maria will remember, and it will help her smile instead of cry." The handwriting matched Dr. Rodriguez's medical prescriptions exactly, including his characteristic way of forming capital letters. When Maria Rodriguez arrived for arrangements, she was planning a solemn service with classical music that reflected her husband's professional dignity. But during our consultation, she mentioned their wedding reception, where a mariachi band had played Cielito Lindo for their first dance. "Miguel always said that song captured our joy better than any serious music could," she remembered. "Maybe we should include it in his service, even though it might seem inappropriate for such a solemn occasion." I assured her that personal music choices were always appropriate and offered to locate a mariachi version of the song. Her relief was immediate. She'd wanted to honor their joyful memories, but had felt constrained by conventional funeral expectations. The anonymous note had given her permission to choose music that truly represented her husband's spirit. The pattern continued through winter, with anonymous requests appearing for every scheduled cremation. Each note was written in handwriting that resembled the deceased person's script, requesting music that perfectly matched their personalities, relationships, and emotional needs of their families. The suggestions consistently exceeded family expectations, providing comfort and meaning that exceeded anything I could have recommended professionally. Mrs. Johnson's note was the most touching I'd received. "Please play Que Sera Sera for my daughter. I used to sing it to her when she was frightened, and she'll need to remember that everything will be okay." The handwriting matched Mrs. Johnson's grocery lists and thank you notes, complete with her habit of drawing small hearts instead of dots over her letter I. When her daughter arrived for arrangements, she was struggling with overwhelming grief and uncertainty about managing life without her mother's guidance. I mentioned that some families found comfort in music that reminded them of shared experiences, and asked if any songs held special meaning for them. "Mom used to sing Que Sera Sera when I was little and worried about things," she remembered. "She'd tell me that whatever will be, and that worrying wouldn't change anything. I'd forgotten about that until you mentioned music." The song brought her obvious comfort during the service, reminding her of her mother's wisdom and strength, while providing the reassurance she needed to face an uncertain future. The anonymous note had guided us toward exactly the right musical choice to help her process grief while maintaining connection to her mother's love and guidance. I never discovered how the anonymous requests were being placed in our suggestion box, or who was writing them in handwriting that matched deceased individuals' personal scripts. The box was locked each evening and secured in our reception area, yet notes appeared consistently with perfect timing and intimate knowledge of family relationships. Spring brought increasingly detailed requests that demonstrated profound understanding of family dynamics and emotional needs. One note requested a playlist spanning 60 years of popular music, explaining that the deceased had been a radio DJ who'd introduced his wife to new songs throughout their marriage. Another suggested alternating between hymns and jazz standards, reflecting a woman who'd maintained both deep faith and love of sophisticated music. The most remarkable request came in May, written in childish handwriting that resembled crayon marks. "Please play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star for my mommy. I want her to remember our bedtime songs." The note was for 6-year-old Emma, who died unexpectedly and whose parents were devastated beyond words. When Emma's parents arrived for arrangements, they could barely speak about music or ceremony details. But the mother mentioned that Emma had insisted on singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star every night before bed, creating elaborate variations that turned the simple song into extended musical adventures. She made it sound like the most beautiful song in the world, her father said. I don't know how we'll ever hear it again without falling apart. I suggested they might find comfort in including Emma's favorite song in her service, allowing other people to share in the musical joy she'd brought to their family. The song became the most powerful moment of the ceremony, with family and friends remembering Emma's creativity and musical spirit, rather than focusing only on their devastating loss. The anonymous requests continue appearing in our suggestion box, written in handwriting that somehow captures the essence of deceased individuals, while guiding families toward musical choices that provide maximum comfort and emotional healing. I've stopped questioning the source of the notes and started preparing for them, gathering requested songs and ensuring our sound equipment can accommodate any musical format families might need. Maybe the most personal requests come from people who can no longer speak for themselves, but somehow find ways to communicate their final wishes about how they want to be remembered. Maybe love creates its own forms of expression that transcend physical limitations, allowing people to participate in their own memorial services through music that captures their spirits and comforts the people they've left behind. The suggestion box continues receiving notes written in impossible handwriting, requesting music that perfectly matches family needs and deceased individuals' personalities. And perhaps that's not a mystery to solve, but a gift to treasure. Evidence that some forms of communication persist beyond death when there's something important left to say. Sometimes the most beautiful music is requested by people who can no longer sing, but remember exactly which songs their families need to hear. The last requests are often the most meaningful, written in handwriting that carries love across boundaries no living person should be able to cross, but somehow the heart finds a way